the speaker here today to this distinguished audience in the venerable Asia Institute of Management. James Wolfensohn is one of these rare men for whom it is almost easier to list the things he did not do in his life and career rather than the things he did do. I think I can best describe him as a modern-day universal man, a homo universalis. A lawyer by training, a highly successful banker and founder of his own investment bank, a philanthropist, an Olympic sportsman, guardian of the arts, broker of the peace, and helmsman of development. Also an accomplished cellist, an honorary Knight of the Crown of England, and much, much more. For me personally, though, Mr. Wolfensohn is the man that transformed the World Bank, and I think he transformed the development debate. In his exceptional 2 terms at the helm of the institution, he opened up the bank to its many critics from the left and the right, and he turned many of them, not all of them, but many of them, into strong development partners. He changed countries from the subject matter of technocratic policies into clients that needed to be supported in finding their own solutions to their development problems. He moved the bank from a Washington-based and most of the time Washington-centric organization to a very decentralized organization where the country teams in the field enjoy large discretion in choosing the way to serve their clients. He also turned the intractable debt problem, and Mr. Strada talked about it. He also turned the intractable debt problem of some of the poorest countries into the world into a manageable process leading to debt relief that allowed those countries a second chance for development success. And with the comprehensive development framework that he launched in 1997, he promoted a broader concept of development that went well beyond increases in material well-being that used to be the sole compass for success for the bank and for development economics. And just to illustrate how significant that was, my previous 3 years I spent in China, and China's harmonious society, which is now the banner of their development model, is inspired by the comprehensive development framework launched by Jim Wolfensohn in 1997. In my personal view, though, the most important contribution of Wolfensohn to the bank and to the development debate, and one that is highly relevant for the Philippines today, is that he made the issue of corruption debatable within the World Bank and in the development community. Through his Cancer of Corruption speech of 1996, Wolfensohn ignited a heavy and open debate about the damage that corruption does to development and to poverty alleviation. With that, he paved the way for a pragmatic approach to corruption and created the space for his staff, including me and others, to address the challenge of weak governance to the benefit of the world's poor. Since leaving the World Bank, Mr. Wolfensohn has not stopped working for development. On the contrary, apart from his work in the Gaza Strip and his advisory role for the development community at large, he funded a development institution at Brookings in Washington, which has become one of the big centers of thinking about development in the world, and staffed by some very smart former world bankers as well as others. Today's speech is further evidence that development is still his passion, and that he is a man to think beyond the standard paradigms in addressing the challenges of development. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Jim Wolfensohn.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, after that excessive introduction, I think I should go home before you hear me, because it'll be downhill from here. Let me first acknowledge and thank Mr. Estrada and my friend Jaime Ayala, Bert Holman, and particularly if I could acknowledge the presence here of Washington CSIP, who has been for me a friend and a guide for a very long time, and someone whom I have the very highest regard, and who is more than just a representative of this country. He is truly a man for the world, and I'm very honored that you're here, Wash. And I thank you for being here. The subject that I have been asked to talk about, and which resonates with my current interest, is the issue of how our world is changing from the world that I grew up in, and looking around the room, that some others at least also grew up in. and how, in fact, we really need to take a forward look at new issues that are confronting us. As I look back on the 50-odd years in which I was engaged in development, starting as I did in Australia, I recognized when I look at Brian Scott, and we were both thinking about what we should do when we grew up, that I at least immediately thought that I'd better go and try and find out something about Asia. And not having any money, I thought, could I get a scholarship to go study somewhere in Asia? There were no scholarships to go somewhere in Asia. The only one that I found was in Hokkaido University, where there was a School of Commonwealth Studies, and I was too late to get that. Even if I had applied, I probably wouldn't have gotten it. But the truth of the matter was that I then had, like some other poor people in this room, had to go to Harvard instead and do the best I could with that primitive education. But it didn't stop my interest in Asia, and it didn't stop my interest in development. In fact, it awakened it as I had the good fortune to meet representatives of a number of those countries in that work. But what I became aware of was that all of us who were looking at the world were looking at it in a way that really was not sustainable. As you know, it was for many years a world of around 6 billion people, 1 billion in the OECD countries and the so-called rich countries. And then there were 5 billion people out there somewhere in the developing world, and they had more or less 20% of the world's income, and the billion people had more or less 80% of the world's income. And if you wanted to get anything serious done, it was with the United States and the OECD countries and the G7. And the organization of the world was really built around what those countries in Europe and in North America would do in relation to this developing world. I see in front of me some distinguished members of the Philippine administration in the past, but I think there was a sort of patronizing atmosphere in those early days. I recall a friend, Toyo Gyoten, whom I think you knew very well, and who, as a Japanese government official, commented in 1964, and I quote him. He said, "I still remember vividly the day I went to a meeting of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel as an observer. It was the year of the Cultural Revolution was sweeping China. Red card were rampaging the air. It was of high concern to neighboring Asian countries. But at the meeting of the BIS, central bankers from all the European countries and the United States were gathered, had cocktails, luncheons, and dinners, and talked endlessly about gold, the dollar, pound sterling, switching endlessly from English, French, and German. There was absolutely no interest in the upheavals in China. The Vietnam War was at a critical stage, but apparently the bank has had little interest in such events. I thought uneasily the world seemed still to end somewhere near the Dardanelles. And in fact, that was true. There was this sort of egocentric view of the world with the economic power residing in the historic countries of Europe and the United States. Indeed, as people came to visit the United States too, there was a feeling that all the modernity was coming from the United States and from Europe. And I remember in a book by Robert Kagan, A Dangerous Nation, a quote from a young group of Meiji reformers who came from Japan in 1960. And he quoted, he said, "They came back impressed by American science and technology, marveling at everything from railroads and weaponry to gas lights and flushing toilets." This was all in 1960. It seems preposterous today as Japan has the bullet train, but it's not all that long ago. And this was the era, in fact, in which I grew up. and in which I was trying very hard to recognize and to anticipate the changes that were happening on our planet. The economic changes, I'm sure you're aware of, but just to remind you how recent it is. In terms of the share of global GDP, Asia in 1991 was 7.8%. By 07 today, the countries of this region are maybe 15%. But the projections are that come 2050, the role of the developing world, which is now 20%, will in fact be over 60%. This is not just some modest change in the way the world operates. This is a tectonic shift in terms of how we look at our world. And of course, it will be a world not of 6 billion people. It'll be a world of 9 billion people. Of the next 3 billion people to come onto the planet, maybe 100 million that go to the so-called rich countries as we know them today. The other 2.9 billion go to the developing world. So we'll have a world, give or take, of 9 billion people, of whom there'll be 1 billion, maybe 100 million in the countries of the G24, and there'll be, give or take, 8 billion in the rest of the world. And this poses us with an extraordinary challenge in terms of understanding what are the shifts that are going on around us when people educated in the way that I was educated, and I'm sure some in this room were educated, to think, what are the changes that are occurring? How can we adjust to it? The first thing which is interesting for bankers particularly is how the wealth of the world has changed even in the last decade. I was reminded of some of the work that I did in this country some years ago and in the region in general, and we were sort of putting out fires at that time in the region in general, even in China. Today, as we look at the global resources, we have around $5,000 billion in foreign exchange reserves, of which 60% are in Asia. 60% in Asia. China rests today at $1.3 trillion, 1,300 billion. And talking the other day to the governor of the central bank, he told me that conservatively they'll get another 300 billion this year. So that will be $1.6 billion, and that's excluding Hong Kong, which they have a little side package of a couple of $100 billion. This is a different world where the United States is under $100 billion and ranks, I think, something like in terms of the powers of the world, in terms of its access to foreign exchange reserves. That's a different world than the world 50 years ago. It's a different world than the world of 10 years ago. And it's changing with dramatic speed, with which you in the Philippines have a very good chance of looking, because they're your near neighbors that are bringing about these dramatic changes. The truth is that in the year 1500 and in the year 1840, China and India were 50% of the global GDP. They went down by 1940 to around 5–6% of global GDP. But the truth is they're on the way back. And they're on the way back in massive and challenging force, not just to the established countries in the European and Asian and American environment, but also massively challenging other countries, including yours, in this part of the world, largely because of their enormous educational activities, of their manufacturing capabilities, and their tremendous penetration of markets around the world. I'm happy to see in the analysis that I've done the last couple of days that the Philippines is still hanging in there in a number of very interesting ways, and in particular in technology. But disappointed to find this morning, and it is this morning as I got the National Statistical Coordination Board's report, that poverty in this country